So just a very warm welcome to you all here to the Centre for Dance Research, C-DaRE, here in Coventry. Although here is always a bit of a funny thing, isn't it? I guess most of you some part of you is on some Amazon Web Service server farm in the middle of probably the Netherlands, actually is one of the closer ones here. But it's a real pleasure to see you all. My name is Simon Ellis, and together with my colleagues, Kate Marsh and Lily Hayward-Smith, we're responsible for curating what's called C-DaRE Invites. And C-DaRE Invites is a collection of conversations, of events that are broadly about the role of dance, movement, and the body in culture and society. And then since June of last year, of 2022, we've been curating various things loosely around the theme of the body and AI, the body and artificial intelligence. And those conversations have been about AI and art, and critiquing AI, about the nature of data, the ethics of AI systems, and perhaps most of all, what it means to be a body and experience sensations of the body in an age of datification. To give you an idea of the setup that we're working with, there are people in the room here. In fact, at the moment, there are 7 of us. Am I counting? 6 of us. And there'll be more, I expect, because some people might just be running a bit late. And then most of you are online. The thing that we also have is that people who are here locally have also got screens in front of them. And the reason we do that is to effectively sort of make you might say, the experience of the Zoom as equitable as possible. And what we have here is we have a shared microphone. So we're all using a single microphone that's connected to my computer and the speakers on my computer. So the only odd thing that will happen is that if someone who is here locally puts their hand up to ask a question later on, you won't see them unmute because it'll be going through the microphone, but they are here and they will be speaking. The plan for today, after this little introduction, is that Kate and Harmony will be presenting, and that's about 30 minutes. And then there's a response from Kevin Walker, an artist, scholar, and colleague here at the Centre for Post-Digital Cultures. Kevin's work is broadly around, or at least in part around, themes of AI and algorithmic culture. And I really like that phrase, algorithmic culture. And Kevin's going to respond and ask questions of Kate and Harmony for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then there'll be an open discussion and conversation. You can ask questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat. You can also, at that point, raise your virtual hands. And that includes those of us here in person who want to ask questions. And then, or if you really want to be super anonymous, you can just DM me directly in Zoom. And if you're going to ask something that you don't want to be attributed to you, and then I'll be your proxy. I hope it gets like that. I hope it gets nasty. I don't really at all. And so the main thing, really, my role here is to introduce to you Kate Elswit from Central School of Speech and Drama, and Harmony Bench from Ohio State University. I like to think of Kate and Harmony as 2 of the sharpest thinkers in dance research, and it's certainly a pleasure to see them both here. And certainly both of them independently and through their collaborations together have diverse research practices that include thinking and working through what it means to be and have bodies in this digital time. And digital time's a slightly rubbish way of describing it, but certainly something's going on. And their work together has investigated the visualization of data and how these representations might be meaningful for dance historical inquiry. And yes, I did steal that bit straight from your website, Kate. But today's presentation and conversation is about newer work that builds on their digital humanities scholarship as they turn their attention to the ways in which the training of machine learning models can be considered and reconsidered depending on the bodies of those people from which ML, machine learning training data, are being extracted. So Kate and Harmony, an absolute pleasure to see you and to welcome you here to C-DaRE, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Simon, for that lovely introduction and also for the invitation to present some very new thoughts. We're excited to be in dialogue with Kevin and really with all of you. So Harmony and I started working together almost 10 years ago with the question of how the field of dance could make use of digital methods. And as we progressed, we've become convinced, give me one moment there. We've become convinced that we actually needed to be asking the reverse. So how can digital and other experimental humanities learn from dance? And existing methods for engaging with data weren't made for the complexity of embodiment as our field demands it. And so our starting premise is that registering corporeality in and through data amplifies the contributions that digital methods can make to the study of embodied knowledge, but also poses unique challenges. And so we're going to get to AI, and the teaser here is that, among other things, we've gotten ourselves into building a model to better negotiate the motion data that's attuned to the spinal articulation of African diasporic dance forms. But first, we need to talk about what we mean when we talk about bodies, and particularly historical bodies, as data. And to get there, we want to tell you a bit about where we're coming from through two big projects over the last few years. As Simon said, we're going to present for about 30 minutes now and to offer some starting provocations, and then really we are looking forward to this discussion.
So as Kate said, we're starting with the explanation of where we're coming from. And so one of the projects that we're coming out of is Dunham's data, Catherine Dunham and Digital Methods for Dance Historical Inquiry. This is what Simon referenced just moments ago. And we've really been considering some questions such as, what are the questions and problems that make the curation, analysis, and visualization of data meaningful for dance historical analysis? And we've been working with the case study of choreographer Catherine Dunham. And for this process, we manually curate data sets from a large body of undigitized archival print materials. And these then find meaning and expression in tandem with exploratory, static, and interactive visualizations. And some of those are here. And we think that these provide new means to understand the relationships between thousands of locations and hundreds of performers and pieces across the decades of Dunham's career. So on the bottom left, you'll see some screenshots from an interactive space-time globe that shows the extent of Dunham's travels, for which we have city-level documentation for over 98% of the 5,000 or more days in our time period. And time is represented as elevation here. So the yellow at the base map is 1947, and the red, as you get farther away, is 1960. And we think of this as forming a kind of architecture of Dunham's experience. The middle image is a flow diagram of dancers, drummers, and singers that's shaped by evidence of their co-presence over the 14 years. Each thread is a performer, shaded from dark blue for those who joined early on, and transitioning to lighter blue for those who joined later. And we think that this indicates who in Dunham's company shared space and time together, and indicates potential pathways of body-to-body knowledge transmission. And then finally, in the upper right, you'll see a network graph, which shows how Dunham remixed and reimagined choreographic works over her 30-year performing career, including the repertory that forms central bridges. And then representing the repertory as a kind of nested hierarchy enables us to think about the circulation of rhythms and gestures across multiple works as a kind of core body of knowledge for the company.
So as we worked on Dunham's data, we grappled with the dance-based knowledge practices indexed by each data point, the embodied intercultural and intergenerational memories of which Dunham's repertory was composed, and the physical toll of maintaining a transnational career. And to be clear, when we say data, the underlying data sets for all of these beautiful visualizations were curated almost entirely from materials that Dunham herself chose to save. And yet every data point requires evaluation, with discrepancies and competing narratives offering further insight into Dunham's history. And so just to show you a few samples here, on the upper right is a postcard written by Dunham in 1952 while she's touring in the south of France. And here the postcard itself is from Marseille, but the post office stamp is dated and located in Nice. And in the text, she said she's en route to Spain. And on the left-hand side, we have the handwritten names of performers on a sign-up sheet for a field trip to see local Maori dance during Dunham's time in New Zealand. And so other kinds of data sources include dry cleaning receipts, payroll books, programs, visa applications, run notes, and so on.
So as we presented this work, a couple of things came up for us. First was people in the audience constantly asked us why we weren't looking at dance. And that was a huge surprise to us because we were specifically working with archives of embodiment that describe the conditions of performance. But this data was drawn from textual documents, not still or moving images of bodies. And we began to think of this as the difference between analyzing dance versus analyzing dancing. And then second, we felt constrained by some of the movement vocabularies embedded in the data visualizations we were exploring. And we realized that we wanted to represent this data with non-arbitrary motion, or what we began to call a choreographic syntax. So these two issues shaped the motivating questions for our current project, which is Visceral History's Visual Arguments, Dance-Based Approaches to Data. So if Dunham's data was about the questions and problems that make the curation, analysis, and visualization of data meaningful for the study of dance history, then our new project flips that script and asks, what changes are required to concepts like data curation and visualization in order to work in the context of dance history? How might centering dance-based knowledge practices enable us to engage with and forward experimentation around the challenges of working with embodied data, specifically as they arise in interdisciplinary contexts? And how can a data-driven approach that is tailored to the medium of dance transform the use of digital tools to evidence and elaborate the historical study of embodied knowledge more broadly? And for us, the key concept here is what we call visceral data analysis, which is informed by intersectional feminist data studies. And it means curating and analyzing data that is sourced from the complexity and thickness of bodies and continuing to value embodiment, texture, tactility, and bodily experience in data visualization.
So Visceral History's visual arguments started with 3 core strands of inquiry to center dance-based knowledge practices. And as we all know, just because things start in very clear strands doesn't mean they end up that way, but these are the strands. So first, there's the question of what it means to build data sets not from print archives, but from the way history is passed from body to body in the studio. And so we developed a relationship with the Institute for Dunham Technique Certification through Dunham's data, in part through a discussion about how their collective knowledge as a living legacy, in their words, connects up with and also diverges from the data sets that we'd been building from archival materials. So part of this first strand is working in an equitable participatory design process with facilitators from IDTC to build a data set of what dance history looks like from the perspective of intergenerational memory that takes the studio as its locus. And we think this has implications for all sorts of conversations outside of dance as well. So, for example, in archival studies, Tanya Sutherland points specifically to Dunham technique as an example of community custodial knowledge preservation. So second, so the concern about arbitrary visualizations, we were interested to move from visualizations that arise from historical dance data toward a choreographic syntax that visually represents the kinesthetic nature of historical data rather than defaulting to patterns of display developed for the data and information science communities. So for example, there's a difference between an interactive network visualization in which movement is guided by a force-directed physics modeling engine versus one that is guided by specific rhythms and spatial relationships that are reflective of underlying choreographic logics. So in other words, we're going from a sense of movement in general to meaningful movement in data visualization. And as one part of this, we then started to consider the possibility of motion capture and computer vision to derive visual principles from dance data. And of course, there's so much potential as well for accessing history through moving image archives, as well as through the performers' bodies that hold information from the past. But that's also where things got really complicated for us, which is kind of the tangle we've arrived at for this talk. And there's also a third strand about museums, but we won't have time to discuss that today.
So something we've been thinking about for a while now is how bodies are represented in and through data. And we found that there are some dominant modes for representing bodily data. So first, we find that data locates bodily motion through the positioning of bodies in space over time. A second version is medical and biometric data that's associated with the physical properties of bodies and their systems. And the third type of data we find is demographic data, including such categories as race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, citizenship. These typologies of bodily data, however, do not necessarily lend themselves to the complexity of embodiment as dance scholars and practitioners know it. We know that bodies are experiential, that practices of embodiment arrange knowledge, that bodies stand as repositories of memory, that bodies must be recognized as always in process, and that physicality produces relationality. So what makes data visceral then is the approach taken to interpretation. Visceral data analysis proposes that an expanded bodily imagination enriches and opens up the ways that we approach the gathering and interpretation of data about bodies and bodily experience. It's a way of working through inference, understanding that bodies are not passive sites of inscription or raw material for mining, but that the work of the scholar is to move from limited typologies of data toward active sensory experiences, as well as accounting for the self-theorization and generative world-making in which bodies are continuously engaged. So we're interested in the ways that research into embodiment can be extended through a data frame without, however, being limited to what data by itself can reveal or represent.
Working with the viscerality of data in terms of archival materials that did not visually represent bodies has been a really productive starting point for us, even as we turn toward techniques that do gather data associated with such representations of bodies. So as we said at the outset, we see critical data methods as having the potential to bring embodiment out of the archives, but it's challenging. And that negotiation itself helps us to see bodies differently in history. So as we began to turn further toward digital methods that center dance-based knowledge practices, we began to wonder how the principles of slow manual data curation that we developed as part of our earlier visceral data analysis might also accommodate methods that are more familiar to articulating dance practice, oral history, movement analysis, even motion data. And as part of that, we also started to explore historical film footage. So the Dunham community is an acute site to have this discussion because they're particularly attuned to generational knowledge and change within physical practice over time. But the repertory tied to the technique is no longer in active circulation due to rights issues. In addition, at the same time as so many elders remain present and active in the process of transmission, fewer and fewer individuals who performed with Dunham's company from the 30s onwards, which they identify as the first and second generation of dancers, are alive. And indeed, with Dunham having passed in 2006, IDTC is certifying its first generations of dancers who never studied with her directly at all. However, having Dunham as a case study has always pushed us toward weighing the potential benefits and harm of this work. So one of the dangers here was we more precisely try to locate movement data, is that the more we risk limiting rather than expanding our understandings of all the things dance does. So how can data represent the feel of a particular movement with all of its history, variableness, rhythmic precision, complexity, spirituality, and community building properties? How might we find visual forms for movement data that are specific enough to be meaningful, yet resist binding it into a singular way of being understood?
A core problem of this talk then is how such complex conversations about bodies sit in relation to the potential of elaborating understandings of historical embodiment in relation to data, in particular motion data, and ways we might want to get at motion data through processes like computer vision and machine learning. And we'd like to pose this problem in relation to the very structure of our research team. So our newest researcher, Nicola Plant, and I saw her pop in, so sorry for putting you on the spot here, but our newest researcher, Nicola Plant, is a computer scientist and creative technologist who speaks very easily about motion capture. Whereas Tia Monique Uzor, her body of research is about avoiding capture in Black British dance. And this productive tension between technological norms and dance communities has been something we're interested to continuously engage rather than try to resolve. At the core of the conversation that emerged about this relationship between motion capture and avoiding capture is something we've been circling around for a long time. In critical data spaces, it seems like we just find ourselves at an impasse. Either we acquiesce that bodies are always subjected to data regimes, or we negate it all and perceive the whole enterprise as simply too dangerous to do anything with data and bodies, period. So how can technological praxis bring bodily experience and knowledge into scholarship without doing violence in the process? In particular, how might dance-based knowledge practices help us toward new ways of approaching data and its visualization as a humanistic concern, one that has the capacity to invite just enough embodiment in while resisting the illusion that it can ever be fully known?
So as we explained before, a big part of this in terms of visceral data analysis is slowing down enough to infer experience from the archives. But of course, when we arrive at historical motion data, the processes of inference change, in part because there's an increasing reliance on computational models to gather and assemble data that are not ours and which reflect hidden logics. So we began to work with our IDTC facilitators to explore the changes in two specific technique elements over time, the Dunham walk and fall in recovery. And these changes were the result of local styles, but also generational change. And so the history of fall and recovery also includes a revision in terms of how dancers are taught to articulate the spine, so the undulation versus the ripple. At the same time as we were discussing how contemporary elders carried many generations of practice in their bodies simultaneously, we also asked Nicola to begin to look at what kind of motion data is accessible from historical footage of these two movements. And that's where inference comes in. As she tried one existing pose estimation package after another on footage that's available from the Library of Congress Digital Archive, and you see some examples here, we began to realize that none of them could satisfactorily capture the specificity of this spinal undulation. So I'm going to let this play for a few moments. So here you see two of the 8 pose estimators that Nicola has seriously investigated, and some more came up in the process as well. So my very cheeky version of this is, even when it's good, it still isn't awesome, and bad is really bad. So most existing pose estimation models struggle with African diasporic practices like Dunham technique because they haven't been exposed to Afrocentric data that would train algorithms and processes of inference necessary to engage with these movement practices. And of course, to name the paradox here, at the same time as pose estimation software is often used to extract the movement of brown and particularly Black bodies, especially from online videos, it's not trained on those movement vocabularies.
So pose estimation needs training data to practice on, which means most often it needs annotated and tagged data, i.e. it needs people to tell it what to pay attention to and what to ignore. And we know that this labor is frequently outsourced to already vulnerable populations. When viewed through the lens of motion extraction, specifically a computer vision approach to pose estimation, human bodies are analyzed through specific features, their orientation in space, the location of key landmarks such as head, hands, feet, axes of rotation, flexion, and extension, i.e. their joints, and the estimated spatial displacement of body parts in time, so gestures, steps, and moves. There are different ways of working, but both in a literal and in a figurative sense, bodily motion is what can be seen combined with what can be imagined. So bodily interiors might be inferred through the projection of a skeletal structure, for example, but neither pose estimation nor motion capture illustrates muscular initiation or the qualitative force of a movement. And we find that dance is frequently employed as a limit case for pose estimation. If a model works on dancing, it's very likely to work on more simple movements. As we experimented with available pose estimation packages, we've been fascinated by the theories of the body they reveal. Kinematic models, like you see on the left, are popular because they're computationally lightweight, but they infer the movement of the spine, something that consists of 33 vertebrae, from just a couple of points. And the same is true of conventional motion capture. But mobile hips and shoulders with a rigid spine are really not going to tell you much about Dunham isolations or Jan Valou. And so this is a problem that is both cultural and computational. What isn't captured can't be represented, and that in turn perpetuates certain bodies and vocabularies as a normative baseline against which other corporeal expressions are mapped and measured. Jessica Reiko recently wrote a piece for Movement Computing that looked at every time the word dance was used in an ACM paper without qualification. And of course, you can imagine that she found a lot of unmarked whiteness and unnamed European forms hidden behind that term. This creates a catch-22 between being invisible or semi-visible to the machine on the one hand, and visibility participating in surveillance, extraction, and oppression on the other. And here we would refer you to Sophia Noble, Ruha Benjamin, and others writing about this topic. So even as we're curious about improving pose estimation for dance movements rooted in the African diaspora, we're also aware that the difference between recognition and surveillance is not one of the technology employed, but it's about the implementation. At the forefront of our own thinking through this work is how to work toward inclusive representation in refining technological attunement to non-Western lineages of movement without advancing the goals of surveillance politics or reducing embodiment to exclusively physical or anatomical models.
So if machine learning contexts rely on computational processes, to slow such processes of inference down and find meaningful opportunities to engage with historical embodiment in relation to motion data. So last week we went with Rochelle Tavernier and Celia Benvenuti from IDTC into the Motion Lab at the Advanced Center for Computing and Art and Design at OSU. And one of the things we were working on in the studio with ACAD was 2D video and 3D motion capture, specifically of the back and spine in the context of dance movement, as well as specific exercises from the Dunham technique to both build a bespoke training data set and also gather more motion data in service of our historical inquiry. And for us, this is a way of continuing our commitment to small data and slow scholarship. And so toward this problem of the spine we're talking about, here is Celia Benvenuti doing Jan Valou for that training data set. And can we play that video? So we added additional spinal markers to the mocap array, also some on the floating ribs. And you can see on the back screen how the automatically generated biped has a much more limited range of spinal articulation than you get from Celia. And there's also a gap between the live motion data from her additional markers and the biped shape. And as we were doing this, we kept thinking how Dunham technique is such a great example because there's so much physical training that focuses on the specificity of spinal articulation that Rochelle and Celia's demonstrations could really particularize the movement of each spinal area in a way that our CS colleagues found pretty overwhelming. And so as we're working beyond the training data set, which sits alongside this, toward questions of what might be possible with such attuned motion data, it's not that any one body alone will hold the history. So we have Celia, who herself is also a teacher, standing as a next generation of demonstrator together with Rochelle, who was one of Dunham's key demonstrators and codified much of the technique as it's taught today. So in fact, Rochelle is both the demonstrator for Dunham in that first still we showed on the left, and then the teacher in some of the Library of Congress footage that we showed later. And so there's something really lovely about having her again as a teacher in this context, where we can also consider the full range of words and movements and micro movements that belong to the knowledge and transmission of a technique. And so here we were really interested in gathering motion data, not just from full out demonstration, but from the nuances of Rochelle verbally cueing and physically marking the movement and all of the descriptive language and stories that come along with it. And yet at the same time, we're thinking about what it means to have a single body that's capable of providing movement data from multiple generational iterations of a single practice, which is how dance lives in a studio as well. So as we planned the details of this laboratory experiment in terms of the challenges and possibilities of motion data, Rochelle reminded us that Catherine Dunham didn't want to be notated. She wanted to be documented, but she didn't want dance notation because she felt that that was insufficient in comparison with the movement's real reason.
This work with IDTC connects to our project's broader goal of creating data visualizations imbued with meaningful and relevant motion based in a choreographer's own movement vocabulary. Retaining the historical and cultural context of this movement is therefore key, and Flash from the past, even though many years have passed since Bill T. Jones' 1999 collaboration with Paul Kaiser and Shelley Eshkar on ghost catching, it still offers a model for retaining meaningful context in this kind of work. Jones famously remarked that he did not want to be a disembodied, denatured, degendered series of lines moving in a void. And the chalk outlines of his captured motion are filled with his voice, his speaking, his singing, humming, and especially his storytelling. Retaining the context for bodily data has also shifted our relationship to open access and open data. Whereas our previous work had been in print archives and we were all about open data, collecting movement data from those who participate in Dunham technique as an embodied history changes the dynamics of access. And this feels especially important for Dunham, whose influence on American modern and Afro-contemporary dance is undeniable, but whose repertory, as Kate mentioned earlier, is rarely performed. This history is therefore located primarily in historical documents and film footage, and in the bodies of a diminishing number of community elders who continue to promote the technique. So collecting visceral data from these sources amplifies the political stakes of the inquiry.
When we were setting up the data agreements for our work in the Motion Lab, we got into a tussle with a senior computer science professor. They wanted our collaborators to forfeit all their rights to their motion data and proposed that, and we quote, if they aren't willing, we can surely find others who will. We had to take a deep breath. Our response was that the professor needed to think of this more like intangible cultural heritage than the any movement, any body relationship to dance that characterizes so much computational practice. In fact, we spent hours last week all together poring over drafts of those agreements to come to a shared understanding and language. And you saw, in fact, on the last slide, exactly how much text that takes up. So this is why we see the stories we've shared around Nicola and Tia Monique around the question of motion capture and avoiding capture, and Dunham's own very obvious desire to be documented but not notated as central and generative, because they clarify what the stakes are. So the question that we are getting to is, how does working with historical materials in dance from a visceral data perspective defamiliarize norms of motion extraction and the dominant ideologies of the bodies on which models tend to be trained, in particular with regard to minoritarian subjects? This comes to the consent part of our title. In more traditional historical research, scholars ask explicit and tacit permission in a whole host of ways, from approaching the loved ones to remain, to filling out forms in archives, to making personal decisions to keep some of the secrets we find. So what might a similar practice look like around embodied data and computation? With Dunham's data, we wrote extensive user guides that provided additional context for how we made decisions in gathering data from archival text, what we released and didn't, and how others might use that relational data in the future. However, it feels like even those don't quite touch on the full range of consent that arises with historical data that's one step closer to material bodies. And particularly in the space of machine learning, which requires even further bodily abstraction, then how can we continue to foreground the interconnectedness of data and interpretive work? How can we retain the focus on the entanglement of people and historical embodied knowledges? Thank you so much for sticking with us through this very new work. And now we're so happy to hand over to Kevin.
Thanks so much. Super interesting. That was great to see. And And you anticipated a lot of my questions, so you covered a lot of these points already. The things that I thought of. It's really nice to see also this piece, ghost catching, which I had seen back in the day. So nice to see, you know, connections to the past and to more recent work. And yeah, all really interesting. So I guess maybe some first reflections. I was thinking that in a way, all data is historical. It's all drawn from the past in a way. What's nice about your project, if I going right back to the beginning of your presentation, is that you're taking these multiple perspectives, global perspective of Catherine's travels around the globe, all the way down to sort of micro gestures and things like that. And I think that's a really nice thing. I guess maybe a big question for me is how it all sort of comes together. So the motion capture data and the archival stuff, you know, where does it all go? What do you do with it? How do you bring them together?
Well, in some ways we don't know yet.
Okay,
in some ways,
fair enough.
the archival, the Dunham's data archival information, all of that material is now or will be very soon available on our website, and the data sets are hosted by the National Archive of Data on Arts and Culture in the US, and those are available under the framework of open data. You know, that was a priority. So all of that historical information was kind of located in these archives that unless you know, have funds, have access, live locally, it was a little bit difficult to get to. But then we're also thinking about you know, how does that historical work that we've already done kind of frame how we're coming, just as you said, it kind of frames how we're coming into this new work. And the thing that we're really responding to with the Bill T. Jones example and being in dialogue with IDTC in terms of their own priorities is to not let things circulate independent of its tethers, independent of its interconnections, independent of its entanglements. And so that's one of our commitments. Kate, do you want to pick up from there?
Yeah, I guess I would storytell a moment in terms of something we didn't really have a chance to talk about, but it feels like there's a really clear, it's been a very natural progression in part. So one of the things we were doing as part of Dunham's data was thinking about the almost 200 dancers, drummers, and singers who are traveling with Dunham. Harmony showed that one visualization, and sort of how that formed generations over time, who was central to that body of knowledge. And as we started to talk with IDTC, it was really interesting. Everyone kept telling us, well, you're thinking about generations in that company. We think of those as the first and second generations. I'm fifth generation, I'm sixth generation, that they are very invested in how the generations move between them and now, and that then became a question about what movement is tied to certain generational practices. And in fact, how we settled on doing Fall in Recovery and Dunham Walk in the studio came out of actually our work on the data set. So we were working on the oral history data set, and we're working with the IDTC community facilitators. And we'd all been having a lot of discussions about how history lives and so on. And we sent them away with a task. We said, don't talk to each other, go away. And for our next meeting, come back with 2 exercises that you each personally feel hold this story about changes and generational change and all sorts of and local variation over time. Like what are the best examples? And all 3 of them came back with the same 2 movements, or the same 2 strands of movement. And that then became what we brought in as our catalyst to go into even some of these questions about motion data together. And like, I think that was something that I was really feeling. So we were just, if you saw the dates, we were literally in the studio last week with some of this. but I think having that shared conversation coming out of this long process and this discussion of history, I think really locates what we're doing even when we're stepping into the studio, and that feels really important. In the same way also as I think letting folks call history how they want it. So Rochelle was very clear as we were saving different files last week, she wanted them named her way. Like I think instead of just saying roll camera will
It
name
wasn't
files
take
later,
one, take
Rochelle
two,
is
take
like,
two,
this is
take
the
three.
spelling, this is what we're calling this is what we're about to do. And so naming, I think even like name things down to naming all the motion files, I think comes out of that same process of specificity.
Interesting, yeah, because I was going to ask how you sort of bridge the quantitative and qualitative, and I guess that's one way to do it. I like what you said in the talk, the sort of cultural versus computational, in a way, I guess is another way of putting it, and framing it as you said, as a sort of intangible cultural heritage instead of sort of interchangeable data. You know, people who can be replaced is certainly one way to think about that. I also like the aspect of your work that's thinking about other ways of knowing, obviously bodily ways of knowing, moving away from language. And that's something interesting to think about. Yeah, I guess how, well, I guess maybe you didn't touch on the last part of your project, but where it all sort of goes in a way, and you're thinking of immersive installations, museum things. How do you sort of bring it back to the real world, in particular communities?
Do you want to start, Kate?
Well, I think I guess one of the premises for us in this work more broadly is that there are aspects of dance that dance doesn't really do well. Like if we get to the museum side of things, how do we show dance in museums? A lot of times there's a video and maybe there's a costume and I think this goes to, early on, Harmony was talking about the difference between dance and dancing. And I think one of the reasons that we've sort of held to print archives for so long is that there are these histories of embodied knowledge and transmission, and that there are actually things that wiggling bodies can be really seductive, and that there are things when we step back and we look at data, there are different ways that we can think about the knowledge and transmission of dance. And I think we think of a way we've talked about this before is the idea of evidencing and elaborating tacit dance-based knowledge, right? That in some ways, so in the Dunham context, I think something, for example, that we were able to show is there had always been this story about Dunham traveling around the world and picking up performers as she went. And that actually then, instead of it being the few anecdotes, we were able to show systematically where is she when these different performers with these different passports join. And suddenly we can show how we can take the thing that is an anecdote and actually say, okay, let's look at this systematically. And I think that's been a really interesting conversation, is what are things that are already known within a community, but that might be helpful to be visible to others. Or similarly, yes, we say dance passes from person to person, but we can actually start to see who's holding this knowledge, who seems to be the center as a potential line of transmission, and so on. And so that's always been interesting to us about data. And for us then, a key question is, as we think about visual materials as well as motion as a type of motion data, what more can we add with this? And what more can we add with this, particularly at this nexus where there's a really active living legacy, and at the same time, the repertoire is not in circulation. Folks are looking, like it feels like there's more and more gaps at the same time as something is keeping going. And I think that's been really a useful question for us to workshop in relation to Dunham. And I think at the same time, it would be different with different dance practices and dance communities. And so that specificity has always felt important to us, that we're interested in what this means more broadly. And also we feel that holding to these stories, this movement is critical, especially as we think about modeling.
Maybe just to add another couple of thoughts there. So if we go back maybe a little bit to your previous question, to think about that historical footage that we showed little snapshots of, as Kate was saying earlier, it was actually in building the data sets around these oral histories that we came to these movements, but then also to find documentation of them in the archives, and to then begin this process of experimentation of, can we access historical modes of embodiment through the visual record, i.e. not in an archive, not in the print archive, but in audiovisual media. And then something that we've been sitting with, both in conversation with our research team and in conversation with IDTC, is one of the struggles I think that we find is the two-sidedness of the representational and the experiential. And so we aren't interested in doing motion capture or motion data so that we can re-present the choreography. We're not interested in that kind of representational mode. We're interested in something else, something that lends itself to the experiential, which doesn't mean that like sitting in having a visual experience isn't experiential. That's not what I mean. But instead of having a kind of experience of something else being on screen, how can we actually invite people's bodies into something, whether through immersive experiences or AR, VR kinds of experiences, or even feeling awe in relation to something that is very large or very small, the kind of micro and macro you were gesturing to earlier. But something else that is interesting to think about is when we are engaged in a data context, it's really easy to have this default of data is statistics. Yeah. And particularly when we're thinking about Black and Brown embodiment and histories and individuals, how do we open that up so that data is creative? Data can be many things, and it can be inviting, and it can be art, and it can be research, and it's not just this record of violence over and over and over again. And then this also invites us or calls us to really investigate these other modes of inquiry and reaching out to different communities or audiences that we don't have previous experience with. So this will be an interesting challenge, but there's also something really beautiful there in terms of making different histories available, and the importance of that. And then, as I said, that kind of reframing of data, that it doesn't have to be dehumanizing or violent or surveillant. How are there ways, without kind of disavowing that data is also dehumanizing and surveillant, how can we also make space for creative opportunities inside of that?
Yeah, I guess that's the interesting challenge, because thinking of taking motion data, and then you get these sort of degendered avatars, and what happens to them? What do you do with them? Who are those avatars? And as you say, that's sort of never quite good enough. You need 32 points along the spine to get accurate motion and so forth. So that's really interesting. I read an interview with Shoshana Zuboff yesterday, actually, known for sort of surveillance capitalism research, and she said something about that technology itself isn't the problem, but it's more the economic model, basically theft, taking people's data. So we could instead, or could we, I guess that's the question, could we instead use data and prediction for good? And I guess that's the challenge with research like what you're doing, is using sort of technical and scientific techniques, models and prediction, which are inherently, grounded in a particular culture, and come with particular values, how you pull away from that in a way. And could you, for example, start from other cultural assumptions and things like that. So interesting challenges going forward, maybe.
Yeah, and starting from different cultural perspectives and thinking, while knowing that to indulge other perspectives also makes one available to co-optation, right? So it's yes, and
Yeah,
it's kind of the both. I really like that, thinking through the economic model, and that's also why, as we were talking about earlier, the question of open data versus not, open access versus not, what are we making available? What are the stakes, or the ethics when we're dealing with bodily data has really shifted. Particularly if we're thinking about Fortnite emotes or Roblox choreography or TikTok dances, the way things circulate by getting picked up and disinstantiated from their circumstances for the purposes of capital, whether it's like monetary forms of capital or whether it's a kind of social or cultural capital. I think like that is the question of our times.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So maybe I'll hand over. I'm sure other people have lots of questions. Thank you for this opportunity, Simon, and thank you both for this amazing research. So good.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I'm going to unspotlight you. Don't think of that as a demotion, or perhaps do think of it as a demotion. Harmony and Kate, so what we can do now is open out for other people to ask questions. And so if you'd like to ask a question live, you can just raise your virtual hand, or you can ask a question in the chat, which I can read out. There's no hurry. There's something strange about the compression of time that happens when we're all in front of screens, and the kinds of ways in which we inhabit silences that I find to be quite discombobulating. So don't feel at all like we need to fill this space like I'm doing right now. And but also just to say, Kate and Harmony, that beautiful statement about small data and slow scholarship, it seems like the sort of the antithesis of move fast and break things. I think I'm going to get a t-shirt printed with that on it.
Print one for us too. Or I guess it would actually be print two for us.
I like the idea of you both squeezing into one though.
I see Sarah Watley has a hand up.
I was desperately trying to do the thing that I meant to do, but in the end I just did this thing. Thank you. What an absolutely gorgeous and fabulous presentation. Thank you so much. I mean, there's so much in there and I can't possibly kind of begin to kind of process it all for the moment, but thank you. And having followed some of the earlier sort of iterations of your work and hearing about where it's going next, I'm just so excited about it. I have I have a question, I suppose, which is to do with your thinking around authority, because there's something really interesting about the shifting over time of the different ways in which authority kind of exerts itself in these kind of processes. And I just wondered if you had any views on that. And I'm thinking, there was that lovely, I think, Kate, you said that, Dunham, she doesn't want to be notated, but she does want to be documented. I thought, oh, okay, so there's something interesting in that. And I'm thinking, I wonder what she'd make of today and what you're doing today. It would be fascinating. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that, if what you're doing now, or there's a reconfiguration of how we think about authority in this kind of work.
So I could speak to a few thoughts that come up that may be more scattered, but I guess the first thing that feels really important is, I think, for us as scholars and for us as dance scholars, we walked into this work about 10 years ago going, oh, there's so much digital stuff happening elsewhere. Dance isn't at this party. How do we bring dance to this party? And then I think as we got more confident and more comfortable in that, we started to be like, no, dance needs more authority. Like dance doesn't just need to be at this party. Dance has something different to say to this party. Like, we're having a different cocktail party conversation here. And so how do we insert that? How do we change it? How do we make demands from a position of dance? And I think, you know, something that really strikes me is we tend to assume a kind of authority to tech and the way tech is done. And particularly, it really struck me as we were sitting there last week and we're like, okay, let's change where the array is. And we're having all these discussions about, oh, no, you're going to have too many occlusions if we put markers there, and it's going to take us till the summer to process it. And we're having all these really practical discussions of, no, there's just things you do and don't do. And as in kind of a creative dance practice, we're really used to, oh, there's tech and we can change it a certain amount, but like, we're just going to work in creative parameters. There's these creative constraints that we just have to, that are productive, and we're just going to work into them and with them, and that's it. And I think this demand that actually we might need to change things technologically is something that it's taken us a little bit of time to work into. But that feels more and more important is what is the thing that actually dance, and of course this falls into all of the Dance Research Matters conversations, but what is the thing that dance actually needs to hold more authority in these spaces?
Maybe I would also just throw in there that there's authority, and then there's also expertise, and sometimes they overlap and sometimes they don't. And one of the things that has emerged as a role for us is to protect the authority of expertise when coming into new spaces. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but you know, whether we ourselves have spent long hours in the studio or whether we're working with those who have, or, you know, Kate was kind of walking us through Rochelle Tavernier's long dedication to the Katherine Dunham technique. I mean, she learned from Katherine Dunham while Dunham was in Haiti, and she has been, so like here, like, I don't even know, probably like 50 years of investment. So with that comes an expertise, but then moving into a space where she might not have any authority because she's not in control of the tech. So how do we kind of leverage ourselves to protect the authority of expertise? That has been something interesting emerging. Okay, I'm going to stop now because I see hands.
Thanks, Harmony. Beatrice, would you like to ask something? Welcome.
Yes. Hello. Thank you for this wonderful talk. As I hear you elaborating on this technique, I really don't know it. I'm familiar with some techniques of American modern dance, but not this one in particular. But I was just thinking about this very you know, old-fashioned premise from dance anthropology, in which whenever you start researching something, and especially bringing, you know, this new technological perspective into a practice, is that as researchers, we tend to affect whatever we are researching in, right? So my question is for and if I think of this technique as a intangible cultural heritage, as you are mentioning, so I would think on the dancers as this generations of cultural bearers, then how are they feeling like a change in their appreciation or execution of the technique, and how much this allows, you know, also for a recreation in the new visualizations that the technology will provide, right? So also how much there is a creative work in the playing with these visualizations.
There's a lot wrapped up in there. I'm gonna start in, and then you can also remind us like where you'd like us to go. I will maybe also like just start from the caveat that we have never framed anything in terms of intangible cultural heritage. That was a new like tactic. Like, we are receiving some information quick. What is a framework that is understandable that signals you need to respect the knowledge that this person holds?
That email also did say, I could imagine some top dancers holding their rights, but we can, almost everyone else is replaceable. So we were responding, I think we didn't go into that full email, but
there
I
were
think
feelings, there were responses.
I guess it's worth saying that we were in that language, and then I'm going to hand back to her. In that language, we were really trying to respond specifically to this idea that there are top dancers and everyone else is disposable. And so what is the difference of understanding every dancing body as holding a history? Okay.
Which is also a really interesting way to hack intangible cultural heritage, right? Because like people have like very specific things that they hold on to as as UNESCO designated intangible cultural heritage. And so it was also a very specific maneuver to use that language. But certainly, as you're talking about when you are analyzing any movement practice or any practice whatsoever, the act of observing is going to change it. And maybe I'll give a little story from our time this past weekend. So the storytelling and the cueing is actually really important for Kate and I in terms of the things that we're looking at. But Rochelle is a rather soft-spoken person. And so I was like, okay, it's totally fine. We'll just mic her up. Here's a little pack. And Kate was like, there is no way that you are putting that. Do not introduce that, because it will completely change everything. She'll freeze up. And her way of marking bodily, her way of cueing verbally is going to become hyper self-conscious. And I was like, well, let's just try. And of course, Kate was right. We didn't actually try it because Rochelle Tavernier was like before even like putting the mic pack on her, she froze. Like, I got this deer in headlights look. And so we knew that it wouldn't work, precisely because of what you're saying, Beatrice, that the circumstances have now changed. You are now under a microscope. You are now being observed doing the thing that we came here to watch.
Well, but I think at the same time, something we were really trying to workshop, for example, last week, was how do we actually control spaces? So we were doing 2 different days. One was really working on training data. One is working around some of the more movement histories when generational change that we've been thinking with. And the training data day, technically, because of the way that needed to happen, it had to be Celia physically in the space. Initially, Rochelle was there and they're holding hands, and Celia can get a certain spinal articulation when they're holding hands, and Rochelle is right there, but we couldn't have that. And there was a moment that like, some of the folks are like, no, we have to get Rochelle physically back from here. And we watched Celia's movement change. We were like, okay, let's stop. What do you need? What are we allowed to put in the space? Let's workshop this. Like, how do we make the space what we need and what Celia needs and what Rochelle needs? And I think that's, again, to that importance of, yes, these can change things, but also how far do they have to change? And again, what does it mean if we explain, instead of just saying this has to happen this way, how do you collaborate with folks to talk through what are the parameters and how do you get what you need? And I think that feels really important to us, is to keep looking at what is fixed and what can be changed in that respect.
Thanks, all. Scott, you had your hand up and then you put it down. Can you?
It could be quick. I think it's interest in this expertise dimension won't surprise you. With the practitioners, with Celia and others, and I at one point you said something about authority that was kind of stemming on from Sarah's question in that space with motion caption technicians, but was she not the one who named the files? Was she the one? So, and earlier
Rochelle named the files.
so somehow that's asserting, I guess, some sort of agency around, let's name them that. And it brought to mind an earlier comment that you made about the transmission. So you have referred to the way in which in the studio, they're exchanging information through either touch or their knowledge is imminent in that space through their actions and their behavior. And I wonder then that the question is, how much of that material are you collecting? I don't think we saw much of it today. It was more of also discussion about the data bodies in a way, the implications are for this relationship and doing this. But are you collecting that other material, and will that constitute a part of the eventually how you stitch things together? Because it seems like a lot of the embodied knowledge is in that entanglement of language and taxonomies, classifications, also imminent, present in their practices as part of their expertise.
Well, in this
Kate,
goes
I feel
to,
you want to answer this.
let's start. I think this goes to where we started, which was this data set. We were working with Tia Monique Uzor, who had been working with us on Dunham's data, came into these conversations around the data set specifically. And it was really interesting because we spent a lot of time talking and figuring out what questions to ask, and how I think we also did we circled around and we put things back together and we showed them to folks, and then they said, no, that isn't my history. But the thing we started noticing was we initially thought that studio data set, and this is where I say everything mixes up. We initially thought that studio data set was going to be words, right? It was going to be text, but every time you interview anyone at some point, they stand up and start showing you something, or even they're going like this with their hand, and there's like the language in which people describe these changes in history, especially in dancers' bodies, doesn't separate away from the physicality with which they can demonstrate 5 generations of movement. And, oh, this is Pearl Reynolds' variation, this is so-and-so's variation, this is how I first learned it. And in fact, that was if you are, for example, at the IDTC Summer Intensive, it's really extraordinary because you have all of these elders in the room. You have certain people demonstrating. You have 3 people on the side with different knowledge who are each telling the person different versions to do, and they're all feeding in. And so these collected memories are kind of locating into one body and then moving back out again. And I think that was really interesting. That was something that felt really important to us, both in relation to that kind of oral history based data set that we've been talking about doing, and then as we move into this motion capture. And so one of the sort of just basic norms that we got into in the motion capture space is normally like everyone preps and preps and preps, and then they're like, we're going to do the thing. You're like, okay, we're going to capture doing the thing. And so what we got into a norm of was actually also running the data during the prep. That thing where they're like, oh, now we're going to do this.
Running
do you
the
remember
mocap.
that? Running the mocap and the videos and all the different recording devices during that moment of prep, which is like when everyone actually does the essence of the thing. They're like, oh yeah, now we're going to do this version and then that. And we're really interested in how that sits in relation to the broader arc, and especially in relation to this question you're posing about transmission.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, I think, and Scott, thank you for the question. And I really appreciate the phrasing that knowledge is imminent in that space, not only the space itself, but in the relationality. Obviously, this has a lot of connection to some of your own work and research. I think that what has kind of surprised, well, I don't know if it surprised us, but one of the things that has emerged is this focus on what falls out of view. So one of the things that falls out of view is the motion of the spine, because the technology has literally, like, you get a dot at the back of your head, you get a dot between your shoulders, and you get a dot, you know, around the sacrum, and like that's the spine, you know. So the actual ability to articulate and move through the back body falls out of view. So how do we actually make that? How do we bring it into view? And then, as Kate was just saying, one of the things that is so crucial to how dance is transmitted in a studio space is the cueing, but also the marking, the small movements, the abbreviated gestures, and how do we bring those into view as knowledge production as well. And part of this is also just like, again, you know, in dance spaces, and Kate was saying earlier, you know, that we've really come to believe that dance has something to offer back, that it's not just borrowing from data or tech, but that dance has knowledge to share back. But one of the things that we truly believe, I think, in this field is that the body is an archive. And so what if you have a research project that the entire premise is indeed that the body is an archive? Like, what do you actually have to do to bring that into view and to normalize that and to make bodily knowledge, in our case, in terms of training, in terms of pedagogy, how do you make that available for analysis and inquiry? So I think just, you know, bringing what falls out of view into view, or I don't necessarily like the ocular centrism of that, but you know what I'm saying, like the things that typically fall outside of how we think of knowledge, how do we bring those into an understanding of knowledge and history?
Cool. Thanks.
Thanks both. Tiama, welcome.
Okay. Hi, thank you both so much for the talk so far. It's really nice to see the directions that the research has been taking since the first part of the archive that I saw. I have a question/comment in relation to this example of the spine and adding additional motion capture sensors onto the spine, and this question of what falls out of view and what does it matter to capture, because of course we can never capture anything. And you know, knowing that, there's sort of one line of reasoning that is, we can just add more sensors, just collect more information. And this can be more sensors on the body to collect about a particular gesture. We have to decide when the gesture begins and ends. And you already mentioned, okay, we're going to keep all of the recording devices rolling earlier and later, which is something I also like to do, but you end up with so much material. And so, you know, even within that, there's just this inherent question of, yeah, what matters in the data, what matters to capture, and, you know, you can add more sensors, but there's always going to be something that's not there. So this sort of negotiating process, I feel like you touched on it by already differentiating between expertise and authority, which I appreciated. So it's sort of a comment.
I also feel like there's a little bit of a provocation to be like, sometimes more is just more. And how do you know when you cross that threshold? You know, when are you just adding more sensors, adding more data, and then when does it tip over into like, okay, now we're big data. We lost our kind of guiding light of the small and slow. But I think that part of the question about what does it matter to capture is also embedded in the relationship and in the conversation. So there are some things that matter to capture that Kate and I have identified because we're interested in that from a research perspective. But there's also other things that we are capturing, not because they are important to us, but because they are important to Rochelle and to Celia and to IDTC. And so in that, I guess that a way of saying that differently might be that what it matters to capture is project specific and person specific, that there's not like a, this always matters. And so that's kind of, yeah. What do you think, Kate?
I think the other thing to say here is I feel like something that Harmony and I think it's a personality thing. I think we always want to test things, right? I think we want to know. Here's like, we've worked with these different types of data. We've never worked with motion data because it's felt it's felt like we could get more elsewhere. And then we said, okay, this might be a moment. Let's start thinking about motion data. Let's start working with motion data. And as we did that, we realized we couldn't get motion data that was anywhere near, it was so far away. And I think that's why we showed you some of these examples using existing pose estimators, that it felt like the motion data was so far away that we couldn't even ask the question of what you might be able to do with it, regardless of how good or not, because it was just on such another planet. And so then that's kind of the next question is, okay, why is it on another planet? Well, pose estimation software wasn't made for this. Okay, how do we start training pose estimation software to do this thing so we can figure out if doing this thing is useful? Right. And I think there's I think that's like I said, it's a personality thing. But I think it feels really important that I think we can't begin to even ask the questions of what this motion data means until we can get some version of it that feels, and at the same time as we all know we can't capture everything. And I 100% like that provocation is something we sit with all the time. And that's in a way where we started with this motion capture, avoiding capture problem as well, is what are we doing, how, and Rochelle's, she wanted to be documented, not notated, right? There's all of these questions of what this data holds and excludes. And I think we can't even get to those points until there's at least some better way of working with it. And so in a way, this may end up being something we do for a really long time and figure out that I think we're going to learn something in trying to negotiate this problem more than I think we're ever going to try to solve it.
I think, yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah.
And maybe I would just also kind of remind us that the question remains about historical embodiment. Like that's the question, and also why we were so reluctant to come to a space of motion capture, because we hadn't yet devised a question that would allow us to think through historical embodiment. And most of the ways we think of motion capture being used, it's about like current choreography, current artists, like everything is highly presentist, not because the researchers have a presentist agenda, but because the technology is about capturing bodies now. Although maybe now that there's like motion data from the 90s, and maybe we'll start to have like a historical motion capture projects. But it was really the requirement of the question leading of how can we figure out historical embodiment and then coming to motion capture, rather than letting the tech tell us what we need, letting the research questions guide us even somewhat reluctantly to different tech.
I appreciate all the specificity and care you bring into the decision making and how it tends to be part of how you talk about the work. I can really see it inside of it.
I really like the idea that in 20 years' time, you'll still be giving the same presentation, or at least a version of it. Yeah, good luck with that. Lizzie, Lizzie, would you still like to ask your question?
Sure. I feel like, thank you so much. The more that you share, the more sort of my brain soup is swirling. But the question I was thinking about was sort of about frameworks of translation, because in some ways it feels like that, Kate, when you were telling the story about, this sort of anecdotal assumption everyone has about Dunham traveling the globe and picking up dancers, but then we can sort of find it in the data and see that, that sort of translation and the power dynamics in there, or even this idea of the body as archive, and then sort of, it's everything you've been saying about capture and extraction, but somehow like frameworks of translation and the hierarchies in that process, and what it is to sort of bring the body as archive into a data-centric space, and your pull to sort of bring dance to the table makes me want to say, but also bring the dance, maybe bring the data-centric conversation into the dance methodology too, instead of doing the translation one way. I don't know, I'm just thinking, I don't know anything about translation frameworks, but that's what I'm thinking about when I hear you talk. Yeah.
Kate, I thought you were on that, but it looks like you're muted, so I can jump in.
You start. I'll go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is a process of translation and figuring out the hierarchies, and part of the translation is not just interdisciplinary, but also intradisciplinary, right? So what are the parts of the dance world that respond to this kind of work, and how do we, kind of encourage a certain kind of inquiry and recognition and visibility across different ways, different methodological orientations. So, for example, in the field of dance studies, there is a way in which the kind of historical and ethnographic work is kind of centered in terms of the vocabularies of analysis. And then I'm going to make a strong statement. The dancing body is fetishized and often in an unchallenged way. And then the tech conversation is completely marginalized, even though so much is happening in a technologized and mediated space. So I think that there are like intra-field translations that are required, as well as interdisciplinary translations, as you were saying, Lizzie, bringing both dance into the data conversation and data into the dance conversation.
And actually, I'm just going to say, I see John and of course, Teoma was here. We had a great conversation at DSA this fall about this kind of in dance, where are we learning? And one of the things that one of our starting points was that kind of from a dance side, there's sometimes this politics of refusal. Tech's just not going to work for us. It's going to do bad things. So we're just not going to go there. Or it's, yay, tech, it was wonderful. And I think what we were trying to hold in that conversation was this possibility of both, and how do you hold the critique and still move forward? And I feel like we all had some really beautiful conversations around that. And that's something that, especially in a dance space, it feels like we keep holding this conversation. How can we hold the critique of capturing bodies while also understanding that representation and visibility matter? And I think this is, we spoke to this earlier, but this is really feels striking this binary of either it's surveillance or we can't possibly do data with bodies, right? And how can you live in that space that maybe there are things we do with critiques, with caution, with questions, and how do we make those questions visible, especially, which is especially in interdisciplinary spaces.
Okay, Zara has asked what will be the next step. Do you want to pick that up? Because I know that we are rounding out our time here.
Thousands of steps, of course.
So very practically, there's kind of out of this strand of work right now, the kind of the three next things on our agendas, we're doing more of the oral history interviews around that data set, which is now completely intertwined with this, even though we said there were different strands, they're not, they never are. We are going to be working, so Nicola is here, and Nicola is going to be working with us with some of the motion data to think about, I think we're generally very disinterested in things that represent bodies. And so I think we're trying to think, what else can we do with this motion data with from all of this, these different sources? How do we have them live together as well? Again, with this, as Harmony reminds us, there's this frame of history. So how can these different iterations that are demonstrated live through history live together as a kind of a way of thinking about history, and how do those also visually then live with some of the motion data that may come from historical footage? How do we deal with all of that together? And in order to do that, then we also have the little side thread that's figuring out how to build a training data set that actually means we can get motion data out of all of this. And
We've
so
got our work
those
cut out for us.
In the framework of this talk, those are the three next steps, which seem separate and of course aren't.
Thank you. And Zara, thanks for that question. It's an excellent question to finish this conversation on. Kate and Harmony, I so appreciate your thinking and the kind of light you're bringing to these very complex ideas. As I was listening, the kinds of the language to infer, to hide, to surveil, to recognize, to represent, to fall, to capture. These are powerful words, both you might say literally, but also how they might function metaphorically. And so that the integrity of that, of your thinking, and as I say, the complexity, it's just such a treat. And thank you all for coming, for spending your time here with us here at C-DaRE. You see, I put a couple of notes in the chat, which is just zipped up out of my screen, which is about the C-DaRE Invites website. We've got more events coming up in April and May, and which will round off the Body and AI series. So thank you both. And Kevin, thank you as well, particularly for your time and energy to respond directly to Kate and Harmony's work. Thanks all. I can now at last push the big red end button, which has been tempting me the entire time, like some kind of crazy, you know.
You're so mean.
No,
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all for coming out.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. It's nice to be misunderstood.